And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of PD here at TeachThought Professional Development. And just a few housekeeping notes and reminders of upcoming professional development events that we are offering online and some that are upcoming and forthcoming that we have not yet published. First of all, as of today, the next Thursday, so May 14th, we will be offering two different sessions, which are 1 hour in length and focused on our Foundations of Pbl introduction, basic level kinds of pieces, where we will unpack and explore our TeachThought Pbl model and talk about, in pursuit of a better understanding, the dynamic of what we call pull teaching versus push teaching. We'll also touch on and think more about how to write and effectively use driving questions and give you an opportunity to ask questions. We have a session from 9 to 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time or 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, because we know that there are folks around the world who are interested in joining things like this, so we're trying to make it accessible to all kinds of people. That is $35, and you can register on wegrowteachers.com/online workshops. Also, there are two more in-depth workshops online. One is our Foundations of Pbl Workshop starting June 1st, going through June 29th, and that's 8 synchronous meetings, Mondays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, with some asynchronous work in between. That's $395, as well as a Creating a Culture of Inquiry workshop, which again is 8 synchronous meetings starting June 7th, going through July 1st, and again $395 for those. If you would like more information on the content of those, please again go to wegrowteachers.com/online workshops, and you'll find information about that and those, as well as registration and payment options. If you are interested in the content of those workshops or any of the workshop areas that we offer traditionally face-to-face, but those schedules and dates don't work for you, please do reach out and let us know, because we're happy to personalize the content and logistics and schedules to meet your school's needs. As always, we appreciate the reviews and shares if you find it helpful, and hopefully if you don't find it helpful, you'll reach out to me with concerns, questions, ideas at drew@teachthought.com about that or any of our podcast content as well. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Ron Ritchhart, who is the author of a new book with Mark Church called The Power of Making Thinking Visible: Practices to Engage and Empower All Learners. Ron is also a senior research associate and principal investigator at Harvard Project Zero. And he's been on the podcast before, I think about a year, maybe a little bit over a year ago. And I was looking forward to this book and this conversation because I'm a big fan of the routines. We actually use at least one of them that's in the book in several of our workshops. The things that we touched on in this conversation were around the concept of deeper learning and what that really means, sort of parsed out the idea of understanding in terms of knowledge and the importance of transfer and the importance of content and knowledge, as well as the quality of teachers and the professionalism of teachers and how they may have been marginalized in many respects, and how teachers can engage in these processes to really get more cognitive engagement versus behavioral engagement. And then we also touched on the importance of patience and inquiry and questioning in the process of making thinking visible. So always a pleasure to talk with Ron. And again, I think this is really important work, great stuff to have in your toolbox, great ways to think about teaching and learning. So I hope you enjoy the podcast. Ron, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you back here. I think it was just over a year ago you and I talked on the podcast, and we're going to talk this time on your new book, which actually showed up in the mail yesterday. and I got a chance to peruse it, and I'm excited to dive into it in more detail because I'm a big believer in the Project Zero work. But the book is The Power of Making Thinking Visible, Practices to Engage and Empower All Learners. And that's you and Mark Church, who I'm not familiar with. Maybe you want to give some background on Mark, just to give him a little bit of a shout out. But just as a refresher for folks, if they're not familiar with you, they should be. And tell us a little bit about what you do and what you've been up to maybe in the last year other than writing this book.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me, Drew. Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I've been a researcher at Project Zero for some 25 years, in which my work really focuses on the big picture is creating a culture of thinking, and as a part of that, the idea of focusing on the thinking. How do we make that thinking visible? How do we kind of demystify that process has really kind of been our focus. So Mark Church and I, over the past 3 years have really been writing this book. When we first wrote the original book, Making Thinking Visible, Mark was a part of that team as well. So he's worked with me for about 20 years, first as a teacher researcher, as the early work around making thinking visible. So he was a part of that, piloting a research group. And then that was at the International School of Amsterdam. Then he came to the States, worked with us on some of the projects that we have at Project Zero. So he's worked with me on the Cultures of Thinking project, both in Australia and now currently our work is in Santa Fe, New Mexico, kind of where we're doing that. So he's been a long time collaborator, both as a classroom teacher, as I said, teacher researcher, and now kind of co-author on the book. So it's been exciting for us to really kind of delve into. Now, the original book, Making Thinking Visible, came out in 2011. So here, 9 years on, to really, this isn't an update, this is a totally new book, but to really delve into what we have learned about the effective use of thinking routines, the effective use of making thinking visible practices, and kind of really adding to both the research base, but also the real practical base for teachers around this in this new book.
Right. There's definitely lots of examples of some of the, I guess, new, if that's the right term, thinking routines and a sort of deconstruction of them that I think would be helpful. And just to clarify, because I think we talked about this in the first podcast, but you reminded me when you mentioned Australia, you are not associated with John Hattie and that association, right?
I'm not, although I am a fellow at the University of Melbourne. So I know John Hattie through kind of that collaboration. So we're colleagues, but his work on visible learning is not the same thing as our work on visible thinking.
Right. Okay, so when we're talking about making the thinking visible, and the book starts off by talking about the 6 ways in which you think that can, or it has the power to do. It's foster deep learning, cultivate engaged students, change the role of students and teachers, enhance our formative assessment practice, improve learning even when measured by standardized tests, and definitely have some questions to explore there, and then develop thinking dispositions, which is to me a really big piece, sort of that mindset. But one of the things that I find to be an interesting term is deeper learning, and I've seen it, and everybody in education who's paying any attention has been if you've been paying attention, you've seen that sort of thrown out. But what do you all mean? How do you operationalize deeper learning or deep learning?
Well, at Project Zero and at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, we've had a really kind of long-term focus, and really part of our embedded DNA is around the idea of teaching for understanding. And when I first joined that research group some 25 years ago, that was the project that was going on. And nowadays the big focus on understanding doesn't seem quite as groundbreaking as it did 25 years ago. And as you mentioned, there are lots of different conceptions of deeper learning. But at the core, when you boil them down, everybody's definition has understanding. as a really big part of the focus on deep learning. So for us, we kind of use that term, somewhat, synonymously, and that could be a shortcut. When you think about deeper learning, we're talking about, the deep and rich conceptual understanding of ideas that enable you to actually use those ideas in the world versus, just being able to know about them. When we talked about teaching for understanding, we also said that understanding is demonstrated by what you were able to do. So how you were able to apply and use the information, the knowledge you have, that's one of the key indicators of understanding. Also, and in the book, we drew on the research from Joel Mehta, also a colleague at Harvard, and Sarah Fine, who is at High Tech High, and their recent book, In Search of Deeper Learning. And they came up with a three-part framework for deeper learning, that it is around, the mastery of content. And there again, that word can be problematic, but in terms of mastery, they are talking about kind of understanding. But they're also adding there two other components around identity formation, so that when you're really beginning to kind of understand material and that issue, an identity as a learner, as a thinker, within every discipline, really important that when you just learn about something, it can very easily be compartmentalized, whereas that identity formation is a really interesting part to kind of look at in terms of what we are doing in a rich education model for students. And their third component is creativity. And again, sometimes a problematic term, but we might think about that creativity as centering around originality, which is also one of the hallmarks of understanding, is that if you are just reproducing something that you have been shown to do, that's an indication of knowledge and skills. And it's not to denigrate knowledge and skills, but knowledge and skills can be demonstrated through a replication, whereas understanding tends to be demonstrated by originality. So you are able to take something, create something kind of novel and unique in that. And again, one of the key components of the idea of teaching for understanding is that we are always putting students in novel context in which they are able to produce original ideas, original works, that there's something that they bring themselves to rather than a simple replication.
Right. I'm wondering too if you're familiar with. I've done some reading and thinking and talking on a podcast about Michael Polanyi's work and focal and tacit knowledge, which is that usable knowledge. Which I think it's an interesting, especially if we think about Bloom's taxonomy. I don't know how you feel about Bloom's taxonomy or the use of it, but that knowledge and understanding, at least it used to be. Now I think it's remembering and understanding, but that's an interesting wrinkle in which we find ourselves as teachers. And I think about educators like yourself, like myself, and wondering about the criticism by some who view whatever, and I don't know if you call yourself a progressive educator or a humanistic educator, or if you have a label that you use. I tend not to, but that there's a criticism of sort of constructivist educators that knowledge is not really focused on, and that content becomes secondary in favor of engagement, which is one of those six ways that you mentioned. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there about the different kinds of knowledge versus understanding, and the role. What is the role of knowledge in teaching and learning, in your estimation? So let me, kind of address some of the things that you just raised there. So, in the first book, Making Thinking Visible, we did have a section there in which you kind of offered a critique of Bloom. And one of the critiques, and it's a big one, is that he does list understanding. It is important to recognize that Bloom was a taxonomy, which is just categories, but it's often presented to teachers as a hierarchy. Right.
In that hierarchy, the understanding, you're right, it's knowledge and then understanding. So he lists that as a very kind of low level. And there are several reasons why that might be so. And one of the reasons is just, the semantics around that word, and that in some languages, Spanish, the translation for understanding is comprehension. And many times when people talked about understanding and even checking for understanding, it was at a comprehension level, which is a pretty low level. Madeline Hunter's early work and her focus on, checking for understanding just meant about making sure that students comprehended what you just said, that they kind of got it, which is a pretty surface level again. When we began at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, the project around Teaching for Understanding, as I mentioned, some 25 years ago, that was funded by the Spencer Foundation with the idea. One of the interesting things about the Spencer Foundation is they really look at where there are gaps and holes in educational research that need to be addressed. And one of the holes they recognized was, we don't really have a pedagogy of understanding. We don't really understand what understanding is all about. All of our research is about the teaching of knowledge and skills. And so they funded just did research project to focus on understanding. And so our work there really looked at, understanding, rather than being a low level, basic comprehension. When we say you really understand something, that is quite high level. That is one of the epitomes and the pinnacles of what we are striving for. We want students to come out of our courses. We want them to come out of any kind of disciplinary study with an understanding. And when you really begin to kind of think about things you understand, what you understand well, what you understand deeply, you realize that is not a simple process. So I think that Bloom fundamentally got the idea that understanding is just a notch above knowledge as wrong. And so when you look at that, then lots of things kind of fall apart in terms of, particularly if you think about that kind of as a hierarchy. So we say that understanding really is one of the top goals that we are looking for. And again, that relationship to deeper learning. Now, understanding doesn't in any way neglect knowledge. So the idea of teaching for understanding and the idea of recognizing understanding is, the understanding is our ability to use the knowledge and skills we have in novel context. So again, it's not neglecting the knowledge, but it's saying, simple knowledge is not enough. Just testing kids to see if they know the dates, do they know these facts? That's not enough. What can they do with them? So knowledge definitely has a role in understanding. When we're teaching for understanding, we aren't neglecting that, but we are pushing beyond that. So that's kind of where we stand when we look at that issue.
Yeah, I'm finding it to be an interesting piece to explore, especially in this time as we're seeing so much instruction being online, and I'm seeing lots of noise being made around grades and assessments and holding kids accountable, and even, do you know if the kid that you're assessing is actually doing the work because they're at home and you can't see that kind of thing. So, I think it's important to think about assessment and knowledge and understanding in ways that sort of parse out, what are the granular things you can assess in, if 2 + 2 = 4. Do they know that? Do they understand that basic concept? But when we're talking about, presenting or making thinking visible in some of these routines, what starts to surface is, and I think is an important piece to remember, is sort of a fluency of understanding. So when we have kids present, we certainly don't want them to recite all of the knowledge that they learned in a unit or a lesson or whatever you want to use as the terminology there, because that would, number one, be a terrible presentation, but it's probably not, it's not realistic. So what we want to search for is, do they have a fluency of understanding, it seems, and that can be found by making thinking visible in some of these routines and talking about it in discussion, but also the facilitation questions. And I know you mentioned, use that sort of term in the book here, of being able to pull out that thinking and really get at the questions. And the idea that we have kids leaving our courses as a master of all the content seems pretty unrealistic. It's certainly a nice ideal that we should be pursuing, but it's maybe more important for students to be aware of the most important questions they should be asking in any given content area or such as that.
Yeah, I love the word that you've been using there around kind of fluency, and that's a good way of, again, connecting what we're talking about when we're talking about understanding. I think also in those examples you were just giving, Drew, it points out another big difference in terms of if we're teaching for knowledge versus understanding, and when you bring in the issue of assessment, is if we're only focused on kind of knowledge and skills, to some extent, they can be gamed and faked. You can quite easily, if the test is just about knowledge, kids can quite easily figure out a way to cheat, to kind of game that system. It's very difficult to do that when you're focusing on understanding, when you're asking students to produce something. It's impossible, but it's much harder. It's not just, repeat these facts, repeat this information, and I've got the grade or I've got the score. But if we're actually producing something, if it's what we're able to do, and we focus on kind of the process and the learning from that creation, then again, we're much more likely to kind of get at the understanding.
Yeah, one of the things that you mention in the book, which struck me is sort of funny but sad at the same time, is that when you first started this work, this Visible Thinking project, you tried to get schools in the United States to work with you for free, and yet probably many or most declined because it didn't link directly to the raising of test scores. And it seems like there's maybe a bit of a shift as you talk about it in the book a little bit more, but I do find it to be sort of a sort of subtle problem that we have created in education, and I don't know if it goes back to a nation at risk or what it stems from, but this sort of emphasis on product and tests, and not just this, again, to use your word, the neglect of process, and being able to understand as teachers how to facilitate that process. I don't know that it was ever really highly developed in our teaching force, but it seems like as we work with teachers around the country and around the world, that it seems like teacher pre-service doesn't focus on that, and I don't want to villainize teacher pre-service unnecessarily, but it feels like, and I don't know if that's your experience, like so many teachers don't or haven't developed or haven't lived in this sort of mindset of being able to, say, assess through thinking routines. They find that to be a totally foreign idea. Yeah.
When we first began the research on and developing the ideas of making thinking visible and using thinking routines, and we were working in Sweden, and so we actually told the Swedish funder we needed to work with English-speaking schools. We tried to contact schools, to collaborate with us, and because that was at the height of the standards and accountability movement, no one had time for anything else. That kind of sucked all of the air out of the room. Everything was focused on the standards. Everything was focused on accountability, and so, at the time, that was where everything was the focus. And it was, based on the belief that, if we just hold teachers accountable, if we put in these measures, if we put in these metrics, we can improve education. And the results of that has been that has not happened, that we have not kind of seen that kind of gain or shift just as a result of that kind of accountability. So luckily we are are kind of moving away from that. And we did have schools then, after that period began to kind of wane as people were not seeing results, people saying, well, gee, maybe we should actually just focus on good teaching and good learning, which was nice to kind of see. And I think that, it's a very good thing, that we have moved back in kind of that direction. And Diane Ravitch, was one of the, kind of key architects of that standards and accountability movement. And she has now, turned 180 degrees against that mindset and against those kinds of beliefs. And she's saying, I was wrong. This didn't work. We need to focus on, good teaching and learning. And what we have seen in countries like Finland, that was their approach. Rather than thinking, what we just need to do is to hold, teachers accountable, put in higher standards, they say, no, what we need to do is really focus on the teaching profession, develop teachers as professionals, make them the focus so that we, really can center our work on learning. And they've, achieved remarkable results for that. So having that kind of movement and shift has been, I think a really kind of positive thing in education. We're not 100% there. And some countries are more there than others, and vestiges of, it is all about the test. But you could ask any group of, when I do this, you can ask a group of parents, a group of any adults, about their learning in school, about how much of it they've carried forward, about was it useful, was it meaningful, would they count that as an example of good learning? And most people recognize, no, it was just going through the hoops. It was because we were required to do that. So I learned how to do that, again, to kind of game the system and to get the scores and to get me through so that I could get a place where I could really focus on the learning that I wanted to do. And so most people recognize that when we focus solely on the scores, that's not getting us the education we want. Now, as I kind of, present in, one of these 6 powers, the idea of that the thinking routines improve learning, what we have seen, and this really shouldn't be a surprise, I hope it's not really a surprise to anyone, is that, when you do really focus on students learning, and you focus on their developing understanding, they actually do better on standardized tests. That it's not a trade-off between, I can either train my kids for test or I can help them learn. No, you can really do both. And that with that kind of deep understanding, and when students learn how to learn, they actually do much better kind of on those tests. And we present a lot of data from schools all over the world where we have seen this to be true, and to seeing that has kind of really had that effect. I think 2 really interesting studies, these are at the university level, that kind of point to that. So a recent study just came out this year from Harvard, looking at learning in Harvard physics classes. And they ask students, how do you learn best? Do you learn best through kind of a lecture orientation? Or do you learn best from more kinds of hands-on, more interactive, more discussion, more questioning? And overwhelmingly, students said, we learn best from lecture. Well, they did an experiment, and that wasn't true. Students learned best. They performed better, the exact same syllabus, exact same test. They performed better when the classes were more interactive, more discussion-oriented, more problem-based. Than they did when they were lecture-oriented. So the student's perception of what works, the lecture makes you feel comfortable. The lecture is a well-known format. The lecture also lets you disengage quite easily. So, if you're tired and you don't want to participate, it's a pretty, comfortable setting to walk into a lecture class knowing that you don't have to participate. Whereas, walking into a class where you have to participate can make you feel a little bit more uncomfortable. But the research, clearly pointed to the fact that students, learned better. And so now this, the professor says, now what I have to do at the beginning of every semester is to share this data with students. I have to show them this is why I'm teaching you the way I'm teaching. It's not just because I like this, because it's better. And then the other university example from a colleague of ours, Jirko Sepulveda in Chile. He's now in Houston. And there he was leading the professional development at the university there. He had done some things around visible thinking, and he asked all the faculties if anyone was interested in engaging in a bit of experiment around this. And interestingly enough, that the business studies faculty decided they were interested, and they said the reason they were interested was they had a course that was an entry-level course that was particularly problematic. It had a very high dropout rate. It was a kind of gatekeeper. Lots of students were not making through that. It got very poor reviews. Performance was not very good. They were at 3 different campuses, 26 different sections. They did a controlled experiment with 2 different control groups and an experimental group using thinking routines. And the group that using the thinking routines, they, again, exact same syllabus, so same content, exact same test. Tests and grades were given on a 7-point scale. The students in the thinking routines experiment received a little over 1.2 points higher grades, which is quite dramatic as a result of that. So now we've got some really good data that, yes, engaging material, why, again, this helps on standardized tests is that it takes 2 things to do well on a standardized test. It takes retention. You have to retain the information, but you also have to apply it. You have to transfer it. And that tends to be kind of the Achilles heel when it comes to our teaching. Is it looks like kids know the material. We test them on knowledge. We give them tests actually that look very similar to our instruction. So it doesn't require much transfer. And then it comes time for the standardized test. And it's asking them to take ideas, take knowledge, take skills, and apply them in new situations they haven't seen before. And that's where students fail. But understanding attends to those 2 things. That when you understand material, that material winds up being more connected in your brain, connected with other information, which makes it easier to recall and retain. And those connections also make it easier to apply. So when we teach for understanding, even when tests are about knowledge and skills, students do better. Another researcher who's done a lot of research on this area is Fred Newman from the University of Wisconsin. He did a big study in Chicago public schools looking at just what kinds of assignments students are given, what kinds of tasks they are given in class. So not at the teaching per se, but at the kinds of opportunities they had. And what he found was, he had a set of criteria that he looked at. One of the ideas was that it was about asking students to effectively communicate, to make connections, to apply and use material. And those students did better, even when it was just a standardized test, than the students who were actually taught for the test. So teaching for understanding, getting kids to think, focusing on their learning, focusing on their understanding is going to serve us well.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir for sure. I find it such a strange dichotomy of the way that people think about teaching and learning and knowledge, because it seems like there's like this old school version of sort of pre-modern thinking that I see in our schools, but also see in other sort of educational settings. And we did a workshop with this group of nurses earlier this year and trying to help them teach their nursing students, and everything that and it wasn't the first time I'd seen this, but everything they were doing for the most part was sort of what I would say pre-modern, which is that such a basic rote, teaching, what I call push teaching. So here's the information, I'm going to transmit it some way, form, shape, and especially if I do it a lot, if I do it over, the repetition becomes important, and maybe even we're using mnemonic devices, and there's the lack of depth of understanding, and there's no real sense of transfer. And I see that sort of as a culture in so many vocations outside of teaching, and there isn't that understanding, and it just seems second nature to so many people that I think about teaching and learning with, that you have to have. I go back to thinking about Bloom's, because I do recognize there's some limitations, as you pointed out, but it's a simple, easy way to think about. So we're asking students to analyze and evaluate and synthesize, and those are the different connections that we have, or that we can make, and that deepen the learning. And if you're talking about retrieval for any testing purposes, it gives you a multiple of avenues to find that information. If you think about your brain as some sort of a, rooms or closets with filing cabinets, something like that. But as a to play devil's advocate, and I do think there's a legitimate question here to think about the role of the teacher and the importance of their sort of cognitive processor speed, or their ability to be a really great facilitator that understands conceptually how to do that, but also can act and react. Because I do think there's a sort of a science and architecture of great lesson design, and you get into some of that in the book for sure, but then there's also what I would say is an art of teaching, where you have those plans laid out, the cognitive terrain you want them to traverse, but then in those moments you're pushing and pulling, and you're asking and you're prodding, and those facilitative questions are artfully and skillfully pulled out. And I wonder how many teachers are able to do that at a high level, or what makes them able to do that at a high level. Maybe it's a better way to phrase that, because I do think there's a danger, and engagement is the sort of fool's gold that I think sometimes teachers say, well, I'm going to do this stuff because it's engaging, but they don't really engage in deeper learning. And then if we want to go back to test scores, those do suffer because there's not a real focus on intentionality of thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that there are, I think also, your question, the issue you're raising there, is also one of the other things we were wanting to really focus on in this new book, was how do we help teachers to get to that point where they can make those decisions. And just to some degree, as a profession, as a country, we have to kind of look at the fact that in many respects we have actually de-skilled teachers.
Right.
We've taken lots of those opportunities away from them. So we kind of need to own that. So it's rather than blame, to say we have not put teachers in this professional situation. We've not supported them in doing that. When I work with schools on an ongoing basis, what we're often looking at is, to develop those skills. In the last chapter in the new book, we talk about the idea of tool sets, skill sets, and then mindsets. And I think that kind of goes to the heart, again, of this issue is, the tool sets, the idea of thinking routines, the idea of documentation, those are some tools that you can use. And one of the issues we've seen as thinking routines have become very popular is, teachers using them as simple activities. They don't have much power there. They may engage kids. They may engage kids behaviorally, but not cognitively if they're not used well. They should engage kids cognitively. And that's another thing around that engagement. We want to look at cognitive engagement versus just behavioral engagement. So you've got those tool sets there, and the thing about the thinking routines as being those tool sets. But where we have to really focus then is to develop the skill set. How do we learn to use those tools in a skillful way? And I think you can use this framework as applicable to anything. That in education, people come out with new tools all the time, and often teachers are trained in the new tools. And it doesn't go very far because the focus is not on developing the skill set. The skill set is around that decision-making process. So, one of the things we also wrote about as an example of how teachers do this, and when Mark and I are working with schools, we engage teachers in a teacher lab, which is very similar to a lesson study, kind of patterned after that. But these teacher labs came out of the ideas that sometimes in working with schools, principal would say, well, can you come in and can you teach a demonstration lesson? And I said, no, I don't want to do that, because I said, I think that that sends the wrong message. It sends the message that there's some kind of magic in like carrying off a routine. And I said, the real magic of a routine comes, first of all, in the planning. When you're planning the routine about how you're going to use that and which routine fits, that's the part that teachers really need how to learn. And so let's create a process where we're really focusing on that planning, and I can make my thinking visible of how I think through that process, how I connect it to goals, how I weigh one routine against the other. We can go through the decision-making processes around using that routine. And I said the other magical component is then what do we do once the routine's been carried out? Because if it's just carried as an activity and you move on to the next thing, you have missed the opportunity to build off of your students' thinking. So we want to then, have a post-lesson meeting in which we really begin to analyze students' responses. We look at what do they tell us about their understanding and how might we go forward. So we put that to really develop that skill set for teachers. And I think that that's where schools really need to focus. And again, when I'm working with schools, I always, try to emphasize that, that skill set cannot, and developing that skill set can't be something that you just depend on an outside person. That's something that did work and the school leaders there. So I can come in, I can provide some models, some jump starts, some protocols that will help that be possible. But as a school, you need to commit to this process so that collectively you are developing kind of that skill set. And then what sits behind that skill set is a mindset, a set of beliefs about teaching and learning and about schooling and about intelligence. And those mindsets are the things that just kind of motivate our action and propel it. And the example I always use to kind of clarify this idea of a mindset is, for most of us in schools, we've, and particularly anyone leading any kind of, professional learning, some initiative comes around and there's just some teachers that just seem to, from the get-go, things have, been introduced and they just seem to be, light years ahead of everyone else. They just seem to have jumped into this and are just so effective, from the get-go, and that's where people think, teachers are born, not made. Well, what's really giving that person the leg up is that they already had the mindsets in place. So when these new tools were introduced, they were able to see, yes, here's how that tool will be used. Here's how I will fit that. Because they weren't like, oh, I have to do this. What do you want me to do? Tell me what to do next. They saw all that picture because the mindsets were that motivating force. So the tools made perfect sense to them. Oh, here's how I can use those tools. And that's what allows them to kind of jump ahead. So that's another thing that I think we really have to do. And this is a very kind of ongoing process. Developing those mindsets, we have to begin to kind of talk about what our beliefs and values are, about the process of teaching and learning, about kind of what that looks like. And that has to be something, again, that gets modeled from school leaders, from mentors, from coaches as well, in terms of that mindset. So that is something that's developed, and that's also something that I think has to get focused on in pre-service teacher learning as well.
Yeah. One of the pieces that I've become more and more convinced of, and the bulk of our work, or all of our work, is focused through the lens of inquiry, which I know is a big part of the work that you're doing here. You mentioned it several places, but the thing that becomes clear is what you've mentioned, and I think it's a problem insofar as how we gain as much ground from any professional development or learning is that mindset where you see teachers that are just taking it and running, and then see teachers that are I've had teachers say to me, here's our planning forms, and you can use those however you want. And somebody says, well, do I have to do it this way, or do I basically have permission to alter it? And I'm thinking, how is it that you're asking me for permission? I mean, first of all, I don't have any accountability or authority over you. I'm leading a professional development. I don't have any ways to hold you accountable, but there's a professionalism piece there. And as we think about how do we engage them, how do we get them into a mindset more conducive to thinking, making thinking visible, and inquiry and problem solving, and just that kind of approach to professional development and learning and teaching and learning, is to engage them in those kinds of practices, and sometimes even outside of pedagogy specific. So how can we engage them in inquiry or some of these routines on non-teaching and learning specific things, so that they can see the value and they can see how powerful it is, and they can engage in it in a way that sparks them and moves them forward. And I just wonder, because we have so much professional development, so much professional learning that is sort of really pedagogy specific, and certainly in our professional learning, we try to model those pieces, and we want them to engage in inquiry. But I do wonder too if there's not some real value in engaging our workforce in those practices in different settings where they can contextualize them differently or maybe approach them differently. I do wonder too, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how we think about, because you mentioned Finland, and I think that's an interesting study or place to look at the results that they've had. And I've seen some recent noise by critics of sort of constructivist education that things are starting to decline there, that they say that's maybe a bit of a sign that the progressive or constructivist education is not sustainable or something like that. And so one of the things that is a big part of that equation is the accountability piece. And I've never been a fan of high stakes accountability or tests or testing and grading schools and things like that. And I would assume that you're not either. But how do we hold schools and teachers accountable for continued growth and improvement? And how do we keep that trajectory moving forward in really meaningful ways? And testing and scores don't do that. I think that's become pretty clear. But any particular research you've done on that or thoughts about that?
Well, one of the things I'm a big advocate for is that we cannot allow the test and the scores to be the only story that gets told. So if that is the only story that gets told, the only story that gets told in the newspaper, if that's the only story the principal of the school is telling, if that's the story we're telling to parents, that becomes the story of us. So I'm not saying that we should abandon, a standardized test and all of that, but we should use that as one piece of information. And schools need to look at, well, what are other ways that we can begin to kind of tell our story? How do we showcase the learning that is happening in our schools? So the idea of, say, student-led conferences. When a school really focuses on developing students as learners, students who are able to talk about themselves as learners, students who are able to talk about themselves as thinkers, students who are able to talk about what they do in class in terms of how it helped them, how it connects to the world, that's a very, very powerful story for parents and for families to have. So we need to just expand the stories that we're telling. We need to make sure that we aren't, narrowing down this to, it's the great TED Talk about the dangers of the single story, that we need to make sure that we are expanding that story that we are telling both parents, families, and also society at large, so that we have a much richer version of what that looks like, that we can look at success beyond this very, very narrow measure of just the test scores. But when we let that be the dominant story, it's hard for anything else to break through.
Yeah, and I think that there's a culture piece that can really help when we do protocols where we're tuning teacher planning and projects and work. The National School Reform Faculty Modified Tuning Protocol that we use, what I find almost invariably is that teachers just find that kind of thing refreshing, and they want to talk about and improve their work almost across the board, but they don't often have the physical time to do it, nor do they have the structures and the skill to do it. So the ways in which they can use this kind of approach, which is having dialogue and thinking through things together, seems to me like a big piece of, and I don't want to say accountability, because I think that becomes an evaluative piece, but that there's sort of a culture of pushing each other to to do their best and be their best and continual growth. And again, I think that there's some inherent problems in peers holding each other accountable for evaluative purposes, but in what ways are they all achieving, and what's the evidence that their work is showing growth of teaching and learning and thinking with the students. So to me, that seems like a missing piece that kind of goes with all of this. It's a cultural piece. One thing that I did want to pull out here, and I think it's a really important point, and I've talked about it on the podcast before, but it really resonated with me in the section you have about questioning. And what I would call pull teaching is how I like how you've put it here in using facilitative questions. The teacher's goal is to understand the student's thinking, to get inside their heads and make their thinking visible. And this distinction, I think, is really well put. Thus, we switch the paradigm of teaching from trying to transmit what is in our heads to our students to trying to get what is in the students' heads into our own. And we call that pull teaching. And I think it's a really important piece that I wanted to just mention just for posterity's sake, because I do think that that's an important distinction to make. And it also goes into, later in the book, you talk about the idea of not over planning. And of course there's the risk, and you're not trying to say that teachers should not plan or be thorough in their planning, but I guess can you talk a little bit more about that, clarify that for folks, because I think the over planning piece can be a problem insofar as we're thinking about use of facilitative questions and really pull teaching.
Yeah. Well, again, back to the big error and the focus on accountability is that oftentimes teachers were told they need to have all of your units planned, you need to have all your lessons planned, you need to have that. There was a time, and maybe still in a few places, where principals actually looked at those plans and there was an expectation. Sometimes that's not going on so much, but there is still a lot of scripted teaching, from programs and expectations that people be on the same page. The issue there for us is that when we talk about making students' thinking visible, it should come up. Well, why am I making students' thinking visible? Well, one, you're engaging them in thinking so that they are developing that deeper understanding. But that thinking gives you the window in to how students are putting ideas together, how they are making sense, where there might be challenges, where there might be misconceptions, where there might be insights. And if you've got all of that information, how are you using it? And so if we are over planning, if you have a plan that doesn't allow you to be responsive, this just came up, so it doesn't matter whether you're using, actually much more traditional means. If you're giving a test, it's kind of like, students had all these misconceptions, but that doesn't matter. I'm just going on to the next lesson anyway.
Right.
That's not teaching. When you've got information that informs you, and in a more progressive sense, when you've got information about, here's what's exciting to students, here's where the questions lie, here's where we might go, and you've got some flexibility there to actually move that instruction in slightly different ways, because you can then capitalize on that student interest and still get important objectives across, having that kind of flexibility. And, a good way of thinking about that is, this is responsive teaching. And so responsive teaching is based on kind of where the learner is at in moving that forward. And it, isn't a surprise to anyone that, scripted programs, that unresponsive teaching that treat you as like, you're all the same, you're just kind of moving through this, there's no room for your questions or for your confusions, we're just kind of going through, isn't very effective. That the more responsive instruction is, the better it is. And so, whether it be an orchestra leader, a music teacher, a coach, they do their best work in responding to, where the needs are at the moment, rather than saying, here's what we're going to do regardless. It doesn't mean you don't have any plans. It doesn't mean you don't understand the big structure, the big questions, or the big ideas of your discipline and know where you're going with that. But there has to be a level of responsiveness, so that you are really teaching the students in front of you, rather than just delivering instruction. If all you're doing is delivering instruction, then really computer programs can do that probably just as effectively. What they can't do as effectively is engage in that conversation with students, and that responsiveness to really take instruction in really interesting ways.
Yeah, I think that's one of the struggles that we've had as we've tried to think about online asynchronous classes or courses over the years, and obviously more so recently here, is the difficulty of getting into deeper thinking and learning, because asynchronously these sort of things that you're seeing that are just really focused on consumption, you're just lacking that conversation. One of the things that strikes me as you think about the planning piece and the ability of a teacher to be able to capitalize on those moments that arise from not over planning would be the experience level and assumed sort of ability based on that experience that are at least somewhat related of any given teacher, but also their familiarity with whatever content that they're teaching. I know that as a teacher, the more I taught something, the more I found nuances and pieces that would be able to be leveraged and capitalized upon versus the first time through. And I would think that would be, I would think that, my advice to younger teachers or more inexperienced teachers might be to do a bit more planning and then learn and figure out how to grow in ways that your planning doesn't need to be quite as detailed, but that you can find those wrinkles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think that for most of us, in our teaching careers, we also recognize that you did plan more at the beginning when there were things, but you also found it a little bit more challenging to sometimes deviate from that plan. I guess one thing that I would say as a piece of advice there is that this is still a planning point, but you actually can plan for those decision points in a lesson.
Yeah.
You can say, like, here's what at this point in the lesson, here's what I should be looking for. And here's what I, would hope to see. Here's what I might see. Here's where I might go. So to kind of recognize that your planning isn't just, moving from point A to point B, but that it's much more of a, directing your own adventure there, is that as you recognize, well, here are decision points and I have to read this at the moment and then think about kind of where I'm going. If you kind of recognize those moments, and this is in chapter 6 of the book about using the thinking routines to maximum effect, really talking about those ideas of kind of recognizing these decision points about, what's happening here, listening there so that I can be responsive for to be able to kind of move forward. So I think we can do that kind of planning as well, and that teachers need, some help thinking about, where are the points where you need to kind of stop and take stock. And that's, as we get more experience with teachers, as teachers, and that is something we get better at. But it is something, again, we have to really emphasize is it isn't just this movement through the content, but it is, well, where am I listening? What am I going to be listening for? What do I need to kind of pay attention to? And that's really important. Again, in the learning labs we do, those are one of the things we really emphasize in our planning, is you really emphasize, okay, so here, when this is happening, here's what we need to be listening for. Here's what we need to be paying attention to. And that's where we may need to regroup. And one thing related to that we find over and over again, working with teachers all over the world, is that teachers will often want to over-structure the lesson. And again, I think that's a kind of pattern of behavior that teachers have gotten into, in that, in order to ensure success, or at least the illusion of success for everyone, we'll over-structure it so that all the confusion's, gone away, and everyone produces something that looks like we want it to look. And what I always do is kind of pull back and say, well, let's see. Let's pose this to students, and then we need to look and see how they're solving that problem. And we need to see what they're doing. And then what we can do is we could stop if we notice a couple of groups having problems. A couple of other groups being really, those groups that are successful, share and share what they're doing, rather than us providing this blanket structure that's just going to march everyone through the process. So we actually plan for where we will look, where we will listen, and then how we might deal with that, rather than over-structuring it at the beginning.
Right. So planning not just for tasks, and I do think there's probably in some teachers sort of a fear or anxiety around kids not being busy. That what does it look like when somebody comes in your room and your kids are sort of in a controlled chaos, or talking and dialogue and moving about in productive ways that doesn't look like you have this preconceived notion of what kids should be working on a desk and paper and writing and making, those kinds of things. I think that's an illusion. So one of the other things too that you noted here towards the end of the book, and I think I've not heard this euphemism, but don't turn watering holes into mini versions of campfires. And really, to me, it's just sort of the importance of patience and sort of the art of teaching again, of knowing when to step in and when not to. And am I right in saying that you would say, if you're going to err, maybe on one side you would err on being more patient and not filling in gaps, or basically inserting your own thinking as a teacher?
Yes, I would say that. I think that, most teachers, I think, would say that one of their goals for their students is they would like for them to be more independent learners. And so if that is one of the goals, I think, well, how is it that someone becomes an independent learner? Well, someone doesn't become an independent learner by having someone constantly swoop in and rescue them from every difficulty. That you become more independent by learning to solve problems for yourself. And so allowing the opportunity for students to solve problems for themselves before we jump in. It's not leaving kids to flounder and to get frustrated, but it is recognizing, is this a situation where they can solve for themselves? If part of that being an independent learner is I want students to recognize that the other students in the classroom are a resource rather than it always has to go through me as the teacher, then it can be the prompt. Well, who might you seek out in the class to help you with that? And then again, that lets them to be more independent learners. So sometimes kind of pulling back. And when we do these teacher labs and we've got the teachers observing, one of the struggles we also encounter is getting the observing teachers to get out of teacher mode. So, this is an opportunity for you that, just to watch a group, to see what a group does when the teacher is not intervening, that often they will solve their own problems. And you can see how that's doing. But for some people, they find that incredibly difficult. As soon as they see an issue or problem, they swoop in and they try to solve it for the kids. They want to kind of get through that. And on one hand, that may be, well, that's their image of what the teacher does. That's the image of what being helpful is.
Right.
So again, having that mindset of, well, one of the things that we want is to help students be more independent. So that means for students to be more independent, I always have to look for ways for them to step forward and ways for me to step back. And it doesn't mean you always step back. It means that you look for, well, when can you do that? And so particularly in this situation where you're just an observer and there's absolutely no obligation, they aren't even your students, this is the perfect opportunity for you just to step back and see what happens. And yet we often find many teachers really struggle with that. They want to jump into teaching and rescuing mode.
Right. How are you thinking about, and I think there's, if I'm remembering correctly, there's a resource, a website with some, or a blog piece maybe that you had published, and I think I'd retweeted it or something, about using these strategies and this approach in these online environments that we're clearly in as of right now, and at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, so when into locked remote learning, people were kind of scrambling for this. I used kind of that opportunity to redo my website and to start a blog. And one of the first blog posts that I wrote was about how to use thinking routines in this time. And one of the initial prompts for my writing came when someone asked me, actually via Twitter, well, which thinking routines would be good for online teaching? And my response was, well, the thinking routines you've already been using, because the idea of a routine is it becomes a pattern of behavior, it becomes something that's familiar, it becomes something that students know how to operate within kind of that structure. And so it becomes a facilitating structure. So when those are known, the whole value of having routines is that you aren't having to give directions over and over again. And what I've seen from the teachers around the world that I'm staying in contact with is, yes, those teachers that had, really robust cultures of thinking, that were using a lot of routines, had no problem. I mean, they aren't going to say, they love this or that this is better, but they had no problem thinking about using the thinking routines in an online context. And they said it was actually did enable them to continue their instruction around understanding, to get out, they weren't tempted to, now that we're going online, I have to just go into, here's your assignment, do these pages, answer these questions, submit, grade. They didn't go back to simple delivery mode. They looked at how can I do my best to mimic that kind of interactional thinking, exploratory inquiry learning that I have been doing. And the routines wound up being great vehicles for doing that, even at any level. Another kind of guest blog post from Denise Coffin, a kindergarten teacher in Washington, D.C., explains how she uses thinking routines online now with her students who are kindergarten age, and their parents. They're there with their parents to engage them in conversations and structures. And so having that structure that the students are familiar with, the parents are learning, winds up being kind of very important. So So the thinking routines have been a really nice way for teachers to have a very kind of strong and meaningful transition into this kind of new world of more distant learning. That said, you still can begin to incorporate some kind of new routines because they aren't, most of them only have, 2, 3, or 4 steps to them. They aren't overly complicated. They are something that students can still learn at a distance. We've always used thinking routines in our online courses at Harvard to enable that interaction and exploration. So they provide the structures for really exploring the content and engaging with the content, rather than just on a very kind of superficial level.
Yeah, it's I think it's an important point to lean into if you have been doing them, and if you have been doing those things that are great teaching. How can we replicate some of the dynamics? Not exactly replicate the experience exactly, but the dynamics, and that's what we've been trying to focus on in our online workshop versions. That the intellectual energy that comes from being in the presence of other people and sort of feasting off of their thoughts and brains as they talk and make their thinking visible is the real value of our workshops, not the PBL model or whatever it is. It's the ways in which we're making meaning. And so that then leads you to the conversation or the thinking about what are the tools that I can use to do this effectively, instead of thinking about the tech tools and then trying to retrofit it into some sort of content or something. So the purpose being the real driver. So I know you've got the book is available, I know, on Amazon, The Power of Making Thinking Visible, Practices to Engage and Empower All Learners. I don't know where you want folks to go to find that, and I know you're on Twitter, and you've mentioned some other blog pieces, so where should people go to find you and to get more information?
Yeah, so the books are available from either Wiley, Josie Bass is the publishers. They can be ordered directly from Wiley, widely available on Amazon, and in other countries on local things like Fish Pond in Australia. And my website is just my name, ronritchhart.com. And like I said, that's been just updated that in the past month. And so completely new format there. What I try to do is just to post lots of resources for folks, keep people updated on the research we're doing and the ideas that are kind of coming out. So it's a useful tool for people there. Working on another website around cultures of thinking. It's not made public yet, so it's still kind of in the works, but that will be up probably in July 2020. So if we get that there, one of our kind of current research focuses as well. And on Twitter, it's just at Ron Ritchhart.
Is the blog pieces that you mentioned, are those are both on your ronritchhart.com website?
They are, yes. So you can access all of those there. I often do have a lot of guest bloggers, people that I work with around the world who often are coaches or leaders in the idea of creating cultures of thinking and making thinking visible. Sharing those. As I said, lots of them recently have been around distance learning. Cameron Patterson from Australia also wrote a great one focusing on keeping that interactive component alive during distance learning and how important kind of that was. So those are available there. If you do follow me on Twitter, then all of the times when a new blog post gets finished, they just get posted automatically to Twitter. So that's a good way of kind of following along and keeping updated.
Right, and then there's also a site at pz.harvard.edu that has the Project Zero's Thinking Routine Toolbox, which I know I've found helpful and others have found helpful. I think I tweeted or retweeted that as well. We'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. So, Ron, it's always great to talk, and congratulations on the book. I'm, as I said, a big fan. We actually use the Making Meaning protocol and have for quite some time. Somebody turned me on to it a couple of years ago. We used that in our workshops, and so it's nice to see that in there. And folks, teachers, so we've talked about a lot of the big picture metacognitive pieces, but the bulk of the book is actually 18 of the sort of more powerful, popular protocol, or not protocols, but routines that you've used, and again, a deconstruction of them, not just, this is it, that kind of thing. So I can't recommend it enough. I think it's a really powerful piece to add to your toolbox and repertoire and your mindset. And I forget the three things you said: the mindset, the tool set, and whatever.
The skill set.
Yeah. So thanks again.
Oh, my pleasure. Great chatting with you, Drew.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.